Hello, everybody. My name is Marshall Farrell, and I'm presenting on an ethnographic study of American and Hong Kong music education students. The background, the researcher was a Hong Kong Baptist University professor named Manny Brand, who actually has an American background and has music degrees from both Florida State University and the University of Miami. In the background of the participants of this study are a total of six third-year music education students, three of which were American and three of which were from Hong Kong music schools. So a total of six students, three American, three Hong Kong. The purpose of the research was to gather information on the differences between American and Hong Kong music education students in terms of what's going on inside their heads, what they're concerned about, and just how they are as people. So comparing and contrasting differences amongst concerns of Hong Kong music education students and American music education students. Not comparing and contrasting how much they know or what they've accomplished. That's not what this research was about at all. The type of research that this research was an ethnographic qualitative research. Let's review the term ethnography. So that refers to subjects being observed, or in this case interviewed, in their authentic cultural environment. So in this case, the six interviewees were interviewed in their countries. So the three Hong Kong students were interviewed on their campus in Hong Kong, and the three American students were interviewed on their campus in Texas. Let's scroll down just a little bit. As I said before, the series, or the data collection that was used in this study was a series of interviews from three American students and three Hong Kong students. And the interviews took place over a total of 10 hours for each student that was spread over the course of 6 weeks. Before we get into the differences, the cultural differences that Manny Brand noticed in the actual interviews themselves, let's talk about some cultural differences that she pointed out before discussing the interviews. So, in short, the American culture is representative of what's called an individualistic culture, and the Hong Kong or Chinese culture represents a collectivist culture. So what a collectivist culture is the emphasis on group, on the betterment of the group, on family, on being a part of a group or your country. So let's read what it says here. So the importance of the relationship of the group, restraint over one's individual desires, equal distribution of resources spread amongst members of the group. So the whole emphasis is on the group, and that kind of makes sense because if you asked any average American what comes to mind when they think of Chinese values, they would probably think of bringing honor to one's family, which that is a key aspect of the collectivist culture or the mentality of the group, and setting aside one's individual desires. Much to the contrast, the individualistic culture of America stresses the values on the individual needs of an individual, on accomplishments of the individual, on self-expression, being oneself, voicing one's opinions outwardly and openly, and on competition. So Americans are much less concerned about the group and much more concerned about being an individual and making progress as an individual and beating the competition and always just kind of getting to the next level as an individual. Whereas the Chinese are concerned about the group and one's individual contribution being part of the group as a whole, as opposed to standing out as an individual. Some of the key cultural differences. So there were three broad categories that were observed in the interview. One of which was the cultural difference in social interaction between the Hong Kong students and the American students. The Hong Kong students were observed to be more introverted but they were also appeared more cheerful in nature, which to me that seems a bit counterintuitive. So they were introverted, so not quite as friendly or open to talking to the interviewer, but they appeared to be more cheerful in nature. The Hong Kong students, when they entered the interview, they sat quietly waiting for the interview to begin, and they were more comfortable asking questions as opposed to making statements, and their mannerisms appeared to be more childish and naive. So, in contrast, the American students appeared less cheerful but more outgoing and extroverted. Each of the three American students that were interviewed, engaged in some form of small talk before the interview started to kind of fill the awkwardness. One of them talked about the weather, another one talked about struggles in school that they were having, much to the contrast of the Hong Kong students that sat quietly in their spot, waiting until the interview started. While the Hong Kong students were more comfortable asking questions, the American students were less comfortable asking questions and more comfortable making statements. So if you think about all these bullet points, which I'm going to make sure that this is visible here. If you think about all these bullet points, all these really do accurately represent the differences between collectivism and individualism. So the second major observation of the researcher was the cultural differences in the approach to physical space. So we all know that China is a very densely populated country and physical space is very limited. So the Hong Kong interview space was extremely small, and the American interview space was quote-unquote Texas size. I think the small interview space represents collectivism because the only reason to have a large space, assuming every space is one's personal space and is used for like an office or something like that, the only reason to have a large individual space like that is to hang posters or something that represents who you are as an individual, or just make you feel more comfortable as an individual. So I think having a very small space where you can't hang posters about yourself or your interests and where you don't necessarily feel very comfortable, I think that represents the collectivist culture that is true of Hong Kong. The second observation of the difference of physical space was that in the Hong Kong interviews, all the students placed their belongings that they brought to the interview on their laps, for example, their backpacks and their instruments. And they also brought less belongings to begin with than the American students, but they also placed their belongings on their laps as opposed to setting them around. Whereas the American students utilized the space, and each of them set their backpacks maybe on the chair next to them and set their instrument in the space between themselves and the interview. So each of the American students utilized the space that they had to set their personal belongings down, whereas each of the Hong Kong students set them on top of their laps. The last bullet point was regarding the physical boundary between the interviewer and the interviewee. In Hong Kong, there was a very small distance between the individuals. In America, there was a very large boundary between the individuals. This could be because the room in Hong Kong was smaller. However, the researcher or the interviewer mentioned that the Hong Kong students constantly kept trying to narrow the gap between themselves and the interviewer as the conversation progressed. And sometimes, or at one point, the interviewer backed up all the way to the wall because they just felt uncomfortable with the constant narrowing of the space. Whereas the Americans never did that. They always kept a very comfortable distance between themselves and the interviewer. The last and by far the most relevant cultural difference between the Hong Kong students and the American students that was noticed in the interview process was the difference in their concerns as future music educators. Each of these students were asked what they were concerned about in terms of being a music educator in the future, and each of the Hong Kong students mentioned something that was internal. They said something to the effect of, I'm not sure if I have the appropriate skills or the appropriate knowledge to make my students succeed, and if my students don't succeed, then they won't be, as good contributors to our country. So the Hong Kong students each said something internal. So I'm not sure if I'm good enough. I'm not sure if my students will grow from me as much as they would from somebody else that had more knowledge. Whereas each of the American students expressed an external concern. For example, I'm not sure if my school will have the appropriate funding for me to run my program in the way that I would like to. So that I believe that really represents a difference between individualism and collectivism, because the Hong Kong students, their mentality is towards, I'm not sure if I'm good enough to contribute to this group as a whole, as I would like to. And the American students want to express themselves. They want to make their individual stamp on whatever school they start working at, and they are not sure if their administration will have the funding to help them make their individual stamp in the school community. Each of the students were asked about their thoughts on advocacy in music education and the concerns about having to advocate for the music education program. Correction, each Hong Kong student was asked about that. Each American student mentioned advocacy when asked about concerns for the music education program. Each American student said that they were concerned that their administrations wouldn't understand the value of music as much as they do, and for that reason they would have to constantly advocate for their program, which would take away from the energy that they would be able to put towards lesson planning and other things. On the extreme contrary, when the Hong Kong students were asked about their approach to advocacy in music education and whether or not they would have to do that, sorry, my battery is running low. So when the Hong Kong students were asked about advocacy, each of them said that it sounded like arguing. And the Hong Kong students said that if their administrations, if the principals of their schools decided to cut their music programs, even though it might not be satisfactory for them, they would support their decision to cut the music program. Whereas the American students did not feel that way. And that very much represents the differences between collectivism and individualism, because the Hong Kong students are more concerned about the decisions of the higher power and the decisions of the group as a whole. So let's just summarize the results. So Manny Brand found differences in collectivist culture and individualist culture in three major areas: social interactions, approach to physical space, and the concerns about one's role in the professional world. What this means to me in my teaching world, just knowing this information about the cultural differences, is it just builds awareness for me and for my students and for my colleagues in terms of what our values are, and it just helps me empathize with my colleagues and just develop an understanding of myself in terms of that I'm built because this society is the way it is. I'm built, and everybody else is in a way built towards individual growth and competition and being the best of the best. And my students, for the most part, are run that way also. So having that empathy and that awareness that that's part of our culture will help me be a more informed educator, and maybe it'll help me dial back a little bit on my individualistic nature and understand the Chinese values a little bit more, and maybe place more emphasis on the group and what I can do as an individual to contribute to my community. And lastly, here are the citations. And I hope you got something from this presentation. Have a great day.